Hello everyone, welcome to another session on AWS DMS, the data migration service. This is a tutorial session, and in this session we will go step by step in terms of how we can use the AWS data migration service or DMS to migrate data from a MySQL Aurora database to a couple of target locations, S3 and DynamoDB, and we will see this step by step in terms of how we can actually migrate this. So what are the objectives of this tutorial? As mentioned, we want to see how we want to use AWS DMS to migrate data. We create the DMS data sources, in this case the Aurora database, MySQL Aurora database, and we actually create a couple of targets, S3 and DynamoDB, to send the data from Aurora MySQL database to these two locations. And we create a DMS replication instance which is central to do this migration, and we create the DMS endpoints, the source and target endpoints, and we create the tasks to move the data. And we actually perform the data migration, including the CDC or the change data capture. What we mean by this is it not only moves the data as a one-time full load, but also as the changes happen to the data in the MySQL Aurora database, those changes would be cascaded to these two targets, S3 and DynamoDB as well, that we are going to see it in action. So essentially it is a streaming of the changes from the source to the targets. We are going to see this in this demo. One prerequisite for this demo, we basically assume that you have a basic understanding of AWS DMS service. If you don't have, we suggest you to watch the other video where we try to explain what are the different components of DMS service. It's not absolutely essential. If you want to just watch this video, that's fine as well. We'll try to start from ground up and then try to walk through this tutorial step by step, but it would be good if you can watch the other video so that you get a basic understanding of the AWS DMS service. And one final note before we start, just bear in mind that some of the services like DMS may cost you money if you don't stop them after the end of this tutorial. Essentially try to stay in the free tier as much as possible, but things like the Aurora SQL database or DMS, these things you have to remember to stop them and terminate them after the end of this tutorial. So watch out to the resources that you are creating and then do essential cleanup to avoid any costs after the end of this tutorial. Okay, so in terms of the DMS architecture, it's basically having these components, what we are seeing on the screen. Central to this DMS architecture is the replication instance. So it is a server-based replication instance, like an EC2 instance, which we have to initially provision. And once you create a replication instance, it does the magic of moving the data from source to the target. We create the source endpoints, and these endpoints are nothing but they contain the connection strings to whether it is to an S3 or whether it is to an Aurora database. And then we send the data to the target endpoints, and what connects these sources to the targets is the replication tasks. So essentially we define replication tasks to say that I want this particular table or this set of tables or these schemas to be transferred from source to the target. So basically it is the replication instance, the endpoint, source and target, and the replication tasks. These are the primary components that we are going to see in this tutorial, and again we will try to create all of them step by step so that you can appreciate what is involved in creating and using these services. So we start with initially creating a DMS replication instance, and before you actually create a DMS replication instance, you can think it more like an EC2 instance. You have to think about the size of the replication instance. By and large, generally it is okay if you create a smaller instance for this demo, but if you have got very large migrations, then you may have to go for a bigger instance, and then you can decide whether you want it to have a single availability zone or multi-availability zone. Again, you choose which VPC you want to deploy it and what security groups you want to associate with your replication instance, and also you can decide whether you want it to be public facing or private. We are going to see all this in the AWS console, and we will create one replication instance. But one thing to bear in mind is unlike the EC2 instances, you can't stop a replication instance once you start it. The only thing is you have to actually terminate it to avoid any costs. And also bear in mind that this is actually a managed service from AWS. So you actually, once you create a replication instance, you can't SSH or RDP into it. And once we create the replication instance, we create and configure the MySQL data source, in this case the Aurora database, and the key steps involved in this are: we create an Aurora cluster, and then we create a Bastion server so that we can actually access this Aurora cluster, so that we will be able to basically connect a MySQL client. So in this session we are going to use SQL Electron. You can use MySQL Workbench as well. Again, we are going to see this in action, and then the security groups that will let us connect from the MySQL Workbench or SQL Electron back to the Aurora database cluster. And once we are able to connect, then we create the source schema and tables. So this basically prepares the database. And also you have to do a couple of steps to support the CDC. Basically you have to configure the RDS binlog parameters and then set the retention period. Basically this will enable you to do the CDC, or the change data capture. If you don't want that, then you don't need it, but we are going to see this as well, so that how to configure the binlog and retention period and then be able to support the CDC. And then we create the endpoint from there. So I am in the AWS management console. So first thing I want to create is the let's say DMS replication instance. So I search for the data migration service, and once I am in this data migration service, you are going to see that you can actually create a replication instance, endpoints and tasks. But obviously first thing is you want to create a replication instance. So how you create it is you go to the create replication instance, you give a name to it. In this case, let us call it as my DMS rep instance, and then you are going to choose a class here. So since this is a demo, let us choose probably one of the small one, so that we actually incur less costs. As you can see here, you can actually go for quite bigger ones, but obviously it depends on your use case. But for this demo, let's go for the small one, T3 micro. And then we can actually choose the DMS version. Generally we try to stay with the latest one, and then we leave the other things to default. The 50 GB storage should be good enough for us, and then we are going to choose the VPC. I've got only a default VPC in this, which I'm going to use, and I choose the VPC, and here we are going to decide whether we want a multi-AZ or a single AZ. Since this is a demo, we just choose the single AZ, and we can actually decide whether we want a public IP address for this DMS replication instance. There is no reason for us to have this, so we are going to uncheck this because we just want it to be private, and we just want it to be within the VPC. And you can actually then choose some of the advanced configuration here. So here we actually choose the replication subnet group to be default and no preference for the availability zone. And here we actually can choose what kind of security group we want. So we want to use the default security group, and we will come back to it actually what it is. This default security group is something that we need to attach to our replication instance as well as to the RDS, so that they both can communicate with one another. We'll see what are the rules associated with it later, and then we can choose whether you know in terms of what key you want to use for encryption. Other things you can leave it to default. So here you can choose when you want your replication instance to be doing maintenance. So probably you will choose sometime where it's not very active, and then automatically since it's like RDS, AWS would keep applying patches to this replication instance depending on whenever you specify it. And then we create this replication instance. It would take probably about maybe 2-3 minutes for the replication instance to be created. While it is getting created, we will create an RDS instance as well, because these two will take time. Then we go to the targets S3 and DynamoDB. So let's go to the RDS service and choose MySQL Aurora, and let's create a cluster. So here I am in this RDS console, and I want to create a database, and let's choose the defaults here. Again, we go for standard create. We choose Amazon Aurora for this demo. Obviously other data sources are also supported, so if you want to play around with, you can actually do that as well. And here we are going for MySQL. We can also go for PostgreSQL, but we are going for MySQL in this. We are going for provisioned server, and here comes the version, we just leave it to default. And then comes the dev test. So because if we choose the dev test, then obviously it is a smaller one that we are going to create. So it's going to cost us less actually in this demo. And then we say it is the my source RDS, so that we will call this as a cluster identifier, and then we give a password to this admin user. Remember this password, and if you forget it, you won't be able to log in. And here comes the instance class. We choose something which is small so that we don't cost much for this demo. So we choose D3 small, and we don't create read replica. So in this case, we just go with without read replica. And here comes the connectivity. We are deploying this in the default VPC, the same VPC as where the DMS replication instance was created earlier. And we go to the public access, and then we leave it to no. And the subnet group, we just leave it as is, the default. And then comes here the VPC security groups. So here we are going to choose the default VPC, which is already selected here. We are just going to keep it. Remember that we use the same security group for the DMS replication instance as well. And we leave the other things to default, like no preference for the availability zone, and just leave everything as default. And then we create one. So again, bear in mind that it would take a few minutes for this RDS cluster to be created, and once it is created, we'll come back and you can see that the status changes from creating to available. Again, as mentioned, remember the password here what you created, because once you forget it, it will be difficult to log in back into this RDS cluster. Let us see in the meanwhile whether the DMS replication instance is created or not, and then we'll come back to this. So here we are in the DMS service again, and let us go to the replication instance. It is still creating, so let's probably leave these two things, RDS and DMS cluster, and then we come back to see how these are done. So let's go back to creating the targets. So we have got two targets as mentioned earlier, S3 and DynamoDB. The steps to create them are fairly straightforward. So first we create for S3 an S3 bucket, and then we create an IEM role and a policy for the DMS to be able to access this S3. And then we create a target endpoint. This IAM role and policy is the key critical thing, because you can imagine that the DMS needs to talk to the S3 and it needs to have the permission to create it. So first things first, let's create an S3 bucket, and then we will create the DynamoDB stuff. So let's go to S3. So just to create a bucket here, so we call it as a my DMS demo 2021, and we leave pretty much everything to default, and we block the public access, and we disable the versioning, and then we create the bucket. Okay, and once this bucket is created and my DMS demo, we will just bear this in mind. We'll write it down, the name of this bucket, because we need this in order to create a policy. Okay, and then we need to create an IAM role so that the DMS can actually communicate with it. So let's go to IAM. And while it's bringing that up, let us just see what type of role we want to create here. So it is the DMS role for S3 as source. So you go to the documentation, and then we will be able to see the policy that we need to create. So in this page, I'm going to give the link to this in this video. You can check it out. It's definitely worth reading this. But if you look at the prerequisites, basically we need a policy to be created and a role associated with it, and then that role would be useful for DMS to be able to connect to the RDS. So in this case, if you see what is the permission that we are giving, put object, delete object, and put object tagging, and then we specify the name of the bucket, and this is the policy that we are going to create and then give it to the DMS. So let's go back here to, and then let's create a role. And this role is something that we want to create afresh. So in this case, the use case is the service which is going to use this role is DMS. So let us choose DMS from this list. So DMS as a service needs to have a policy attached to it. So in this case, we will create a policy. There is no policy yet. So let's create a policy. So in this case, we can go to JSON here and then replace whatever we had from the other slide, other help page. And from here, we just have to get the name of this bucket, my DMS demo. And you replace this with, okay. So this is the policy that we want to attach to the new role that we are creating, which will let the objects to be put into this bucket. So let us give a name to this policy. So we say that DMS S3 access policy. Okay. And we create this policy. While it's getting created, let's come back here, and here let us refresh this and pick up that policy for the role that we are. Okay, so this is the one. If you see it, it is actually a custom policy, and this is the one that we just created. And we actually leave everything to defaults, and here we give that name of for this role. We say DMS S3 access role. So basically what this role is doing, as you can see here, it allows the DMS to call AWS services on your behalf. In this case, the AWS service is S3, and specifically that bucket that we have created, and it is having specific permissions. Okay, so this role is getting created, and we just need to make a note of the on for this role. So let us choose this role, what we created here. I think this is the one that we just created. DMS S3 access role, and let's make a note of the role on here, because we need this when we are configuring the endpoints. So okay, sorry, this is too big. Okay, sorry. Okay, okay, this is done, and let's go to the DMS to see if it has created the replication instance. Okay, the replication instance, if it is created, we see its state as available. Yeah, it says the replication instance is available. So first thing we want to see is we want to actually see if we can connect to S3 from this replication instance. So for that, we actually create an endpoint. So in this case, let's create an endpoint. So these endpoints are of two types, source endpoint and target endpoint, and we are actually going to create S3 as a target. So we choose S3 as the target engine, and the target endpoint we create. And here we say that this is the my S3 target endpoint. You can give any name that you like. And here we choose the target engine here. So as you can see here, the target can be anything. It could be Kafka, it could be Oracle, and in this case we are choosing S3 as the target. And here you need to supply the role that you have created just now. So let's go back to this and then choose this role. Okay, so let's get rid of this. Okay, and then you give the name of this bucket. Okay, and you can specify the folder in which you want to have this data transferred to. So in this case, let us say DMS as the name of the bucket. So folder in which the contents will be created. Basically, from the source data, it would be written into this folder. Okay. And endpoint settings is very interesting thing. I would suggest you to go through this, because here you can specify a lot of endpoint settings. For example, you want to specify what should be the delimiter, whether it should be comma or whatever it is. You can specify it, the format, and there are a few things that you can do when the data is getting written into the S3 here. And things which are interesting are in terms of how you want the compression type, whether you want Parquet type to be used, and if CDC is happening, you can specify a different location where you want the changes like insert, update, deletes to be written to. So again, please go through this, but in this case we are just going to leave everything to default. We are not changing the endpoint settings, but here you specify them. And then comes the fun part. Here you're going to see if you're able to connect to it or not. So here, make sure that you choose the right VPC. In this case, I'm just having default VPC, and the replication instance, I just have one here, and then we do a test here. So what is happening is, if you see here, the replication instance is trying to use the role that we have just created and trying to connect to the S3. And if it is able to successfully connect, then we can see that the status is successful. It would take probably a minute or something for this to be created, this test to be done. So let's just see that this DMS replication instance is able to communicate with the S3. So in this case, it is saying that yeah, I can talk to the S3 target. Okay, so this endpoint is created. Now we have got one endpoint created. Similarly, we create a DynamoDB endpoint, but just before that, let us check the status of the RDS instance, because it might have or might not have created, because generally that would take slightly longer to create it. So let's go to the Aurora here. And see if the DB is created or not. Yeah, the Aurora database is created as well. Good. So what we want to do is here, first let's make a note of the database endpoints here. So in this case, this is the endpoint name. So let's just choose RDS endpoint. Okay. So this is the name of the endpoint. And here, what I would suggest you to look at is the security group that is associated with it. Okay, let's look at this default security group. This default security group is created when the VPC default VPC is created automatically. But actually, you don't need to use this default security group. Instead, you can use a similar mechanism or a different mechanism. But just wanted to show you what is going on here. In the default security group, you see an inbound rule, which is where it is allowing all traffic on all protocols and all ports. And if you see, the source for this is ending with the 430, which is incidentally the security group itself. So it is basically a self-referencing security group. So that means basically on any port or any protocol, allow the traffic. That is the inbound rule. And outbound rule is actually allowing all IPv4 traffic to all destinations, basically to the internet. So this is a default security group automatically created, but I would actually suggest you to read a little bit about this, because this default security group is something that you will come across in several other areas, like for example, when you're using Glue or other things like that. Default security group of AWS. So if you look at the description of this, it basically it's created by default in each VPC, and what it facilitates is it lets you communicate between different AWS components which are in the same region, which are attached to this. So in this case, what we are saying here is the RDS as well as the DMS, they have this default security group. That means they can talk to each other. So again, I suggest you to take probably a look at this web page and then understand about this. So let's go back to the DMS service, and then we create a source endpoint, try to see if we can connect to it. We go to the DMS and we create a source endpoint here. So create endpoint, source endpoint, and in this case we want to choose the RDS instance, and this instance automatically gets populated here, which is the my source RDS that we have created. And here we are actually going to choose the engine, which is the Aurora MySQL. In this case, because it's already an RDS which is created, it knows it and it auto-populated this. And here we have a couple of options how we want to specify the credentials, and here we are going to actually give the credentials manually. So if you see, it automatically has populated these fields here, and so all you need to do is specify the password here for the admin user, so that we can actually let the DMS try to connect to it. And here again, if you see it, you actually can use the other options to strengthen your security posture in this solution, but we are not going to use any SSL mode in this, just for this demo. Similarly, play around with these endpoint settings. You can change some of these, and here comes the fun part where we want to see if we can actually have this DMS be able to connect to the MySQL Aurora RDS instance. So it's trying to connect to it with the credentials that we have provided here, and once it's successfully done, then we have got the source endpoint created as well. Okay, it says the connection is successful. That means we actually have now two endpoints. One is the target endpoint for S3, which we created earlier, and now the source endpoint to the MySQL Aurora, and that's good. Then we create one for DynamoDB as well, and then we try to see if we can actually see the data transfer. So let's go to the again IAM policies, and then we see if we will create a policy for DynamoDB. So we create a role. So in this case, again, like before, the use case here is that the DMS is the subject, and it is trying to get access to the DynamoDB here. So here we create a policy here, and let's just search for the kind of policy that we want to have. Let us search for DynamoDB as DMS target, and we will be able to see the kind of the policy that we need to have. So basically, if you see it, we actually need a policy something like this. Okay. Again, if you see it, what it is trying to do, it is actually asking for permission to put item into the DynamoDB table, create table, describe table. So all these permissions it's actually asking. But interesting thing to see here is that the resources that it is asking for, it's not only the table that you want, but it is also asking for a couple of other tables: AWS DMS apply exceptions and AWS DMS full load exceptions. So these two are the tables that will be automatically created with a provisioned capacity, and you need to be cognizant of this, otherwise you are going to incur a few charges actually. So let's probably create this policy, and then okay, so we copied this here, and we want to create the name of the DynamoDB table, which we are not yet created. Let's say that the table name is employee. We create that, and then we don't need other table, so we just start trying this with one table here, which is employee table. And here all you need to do is you need to replace this account ID with your account number. Okay, and then the region as well, you need to be careful where the DynamoDB table is created. So we are using East 1 region, and then you specify your account ID here, the number that you get it. Okay, I will pause the video briefly for a second, and then I'll come back. I'll put the policy, and then we go back. We continue. Again, here ready with the policy JSON here. Let me copy paste this. I specified the account name and the region, and Let's create the policy. So this is the DMS DynamoDB policy. Okay. So the policy is now created. Let's create the role to use this policy. I think we have it already here. Yeah, we have it already in the screen. So here, let's refresh this screen. I think this is the one where you don't see this Amazon symbol here. This is a custom policy that we just created. And we say that this is the DMS DynamoDB role. Okay, so that's good. So it's done. Now let's go back to the endpoints and we create an endpoint here. It's going to be a target endpoint, and in this case it is my DynamoDB target endpoint. We need an on for this as well, so let's search for it. So this is the role on. Sorry. Target engine is DynamoDB. Okay. And again, you can change some endpoint settings, but again, see that it is not always the same endpoint settings that you see across different sources. It changes from source to source, but again, I suggest you to read documentation or play around with this. And now let's test the connectivity to this. Okay, it says the connection is successful. That means the DMS is able to talk to DynamoDB, even though the target table doesn't exist. It actually verified whether it has permissions to create put items and all that for that specific table. And let's now go back to the slides just to see what we have covered and what else is pending here. Okay, we created a S3 bucket, we created the policy, and we tested the endpoint connection. And then let's see what we have done after this. We have done the configuration of DynamoDB as well, as we just have done it. We created an IEM role. The only difference between S3 and here is that we actually have not created the bucket of, unlike S3 here for DynamoDB, we have not created the bucket up front. So we have not created the table up front. And here we actually created the endpoint and we tested it, and we will talk about the control tables later for DynamoDB, which is kind of unique. Okay, now we create and start the migration tasks here. So at this point, we created the replication instance, the source endpoint, the target endpoints. We can actually start testing the migrations. But just before that, there are a couple of things we need to do on the RDS front to prepare it for actually supporting the CDC, that is to enable the binlocks. So for that, actually what we want to do is we want to create probably a connection to the RDS and then create the table and then enable the binlocks. So before that, let us create a Bastion server. There are several ways how you can connect to the RDS server. This is one of the several ways. So in this case, we are creating a Bastion server and then trying to connect to it rather than giving public IP for the RDS instance here. So let's go to the EC2 dashboard and let's create an instance here. Launch an instance, and the only purpose of this is just to serve as a Bastion host, or jump box as some people call it as. So let's choose probably a small free tier one, or maybe nano for that matter, and let's just make sure that it is in the right VPC and it has got the public IP address assigned. So that means automatically a public IP would be assigned, so that we'll be able to SSH into that, and let everything remain as defaults. And let's add a security group to this. this security group here is what we want to call it as a, basically it is the client to Bastion host security group. Okay, so the purpose of this is to be able to connect from the client, which is in the internet, to the Bastion host, and from there we will be able to establish a connection to the RDS instance. So all it needs is an SSH connection from a specific IP address. In this case, I just specify my IP address here, which automatically gets populated here. So and review and launch and launch this, and as I'm launching this, obviously it is going to ask me how I want whether I want to use a new key pair. I will create a new key pair and I will download it, and I will specify it as my DMS demo key pair. Download it, because you need this when you are connecting to the Bastion host. Okay, so let's see, once this is available, up and running, then we'll try to connect to it. And you also need to just do one last thing. You need to establish a connection between the Bastion host and the RDS instance. How you are going to do that is you are going to create a new security group or maybe rule, so that this private address, which is the backend of the Bastion host, can talk to the RDS server. So make a note of this, and then we will create a security group here. And let us also make a note of this public IP address as well. Okay, so let's create a security group here under network and security group. We create a security group and we call it as a Bastion host to RDS SG. So basically this is a allow TCP 3306 traffic, 3306 traffic from Bastion host to RDS. And the inbound rule to this is that it should allow the Aurora 3306 traffic from a specific IP address, which is the private IP address. So basically what we are saying is, hey Aurora, allow the communication from this Bastion host, and we leave everything else as default. Create this security group. Okay, and what we need to do is we need to attach this security group to the RDS so that it can actually enable the communication. So here we say that right now there is only one security group. Here we will attach another one. The default one, which is allowing the RDS and DMS communication. Now we will allow the RDS and the Bastion server communication as well. Okay, so scroll down here in the security groups, just try to find the one that we just created here. Okay. It has not yet selected that. So you see that the name comes up here, and then you say continue, and then you want to apply it immediately. Okay. While it is happening, there is another thing that you need to do to enable the Binlocks. That is to actually go to the parameter groups, and then we need to set the parameter groups for the RDS cluster. So we create a parameter group. So this parameter group basically defines the global properties of the database. So here we need to enable the Binlocks, which will be read by the change data capture process for the DMS. If you're doing full load, you don't need this, but if you want ongoing changes, you need to do this. So here what you do is you choose the DB cluster parameter group, and you say that my RDS cluster parameter group for Binlocks So here we say that enable Binlocks. I think it will use all lowercase, but let us just check it out. Okay, so this is the newly created cluster parameter group. So in this search for the properties here. So here, as you can see here, these are all like a number of properties for the RDS cluster here. So here, search for properties with name binlog. You need to modify a couple of them here: binlog format and binlog checksum. So these two we need to modify. I think, sorry, this is not the right one. I think what we just created is something here. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, this is the one. Okay, so let us search for binlog here. You need to modify a couple of parameters here: binlog checksum and binlog format, which is off. We need to change that. So let's go to edit properties here and go to binlog format and keep it as row. And similarly, binlog checksum, change it to none. Once you modify these two properties for the newly created parameter group for the cluster, save those changes and attach this cluster parameter group to the RDS. Modify. So here under the DB cluster parameter group, you choose the one that you just created here, which I guess is this one. Yeah. And then choose continue, apply immediately. Okay. So it will apply this parameter groups changes. That means basically Binlocks would be enabled. And now let us try to connect to the RDS instance, and then we want to create tables and then start the DMS tasks. Okay, so let's go to the jump box here. This is the public IP address. I want to copy it, and we can have any MySQL client here. So in this case, I want to use the SQL Electron. This is one of the several ways. So you can go to electronjs.org and you can download it, which I already have done it. And once you have it here, you should be able to test your connections here. Okay, let's come here. So once you are here, let us say you want to add a new server here. Okay, so this is my DMS demo. And the server address, we need to give the RDS endpoint address here. So in this case, I hope we have it here. Yeah, let's capture this. Okay, and port 3306. User is admin and password is password, whatever the password you gave earlier. And the database type is MySQL. And now here you want to go via jump box, so you want to choose this. This option is slightly different for MySQL Workbench. You should be able to easily figure it out, but pretty much it follows the same principle. So here comes the IP address of the jump box here. So in this case, this is the IP address. Sorry. So we want to connect to the jump box via port 2022 SSH, and then this needs the username and password. So this is where you need the PEM file that you have downloaded here. So you specify ec2-user as the username, and then you specify the PEM file which you have downloaded. So just, sorry, I think it is in here. Yeah. Okay, so we specified the RDS endpoint, the password here, and then we specified the jump box IP address, and then the PEM file and the EC2 user, and we save this connection, and we try to see if we can connect to it. Boom, we are here into the RDS. So now we say show schemas. Okay, So it has got these schemas which are already there. Let us try to actually play around and now get this DMS in action. But just before that, there's one last step we need to do. We need to set the retention period of binlocks. So for that, how we are going to do that is we are going to actually call a stored procedure, and we'll see that in just a second. So let's go to the SQL Electron here. So this is a stored procedure. You're going to call mysql.rds set configuration binlog retention to 24 hours. So we are sending it, setting it to 24 hours, and then we want to check if the binlocks are enabled or not. It is still off. Okay, so obviously we want it to be on, otherwise the change data capture or CDC will not work. So the reason it is off is obviously we made this change, we set it to 24 hours binlog retention, but the server needs to be rebooted so that it is actually going to have that taken into consideration. So here all we need to do is we need to go back to this instance and then we say reboot. So that means what is happening is whatever we set as the binlog retention to 24 hours, we can set up to 168 hours. But once the binlog retention is set here for whatever is the duration, then once the server is rebooted, you will be able to see that the log bin variable is back to on. So I think it would take probably a minute or two for the server to be completing the rebooting, and once that is on, then we should see that the binlocks are fully enabled. Okay, and while that is happening, we want to create a schema, and then we want to actually get the code for it. So I do have it here, so let me just try to bring it here. So what we want to do now is we want to create a schema called as my schema, and then we want to create a table called employee. We want to insert few records here, and then we want to select from it. So let's just execute these bits once the database completes the reboot. Okay, I hope it has done the rebooting. Still doing it. Yeah, now it is done. So let's see if the connection is still on or whether we need to reconnect. Let's execute this specific bit here. Yeah, now the binlog settings are on. Now let us create this schema. Create schema if not exists my schema, and then we want to use that schema, and in that use schema we want to create a table and then insert few records, and we want to select from it. Let's just execute all these at once. It says my schema emp doesn't exist. That means there's something wrong here. So I think I changed this to employee. Okay, and once this is done, okay, so it has inserted 4 records, which we are able to see it here. So basically the source database is fully ready with all the binlocks and schema objects ready. Now let us create a couple of tasks to see that the data gets transferred. Okay, so let's go to the DMS here, and we create 2 tasks. One task is to move from Aurora to S3, the other one to DynamoDB. For the same replication instance, you can have several tasks here. So create a task. So this is basically from MySQL to S3 task. So we are using our replication instance, the only one, and the source is whatever is the source that we actually created, MySQL source, and target is S3 target. And here comes the options, whether you want to migrate an existing data, or this is the CDC, migrate the existing data and the ongoing changes, or this is just only the changes. So we will choose this one. That means we will get all the 4 records, and any changes that we do on the source, we will be able to see it in the target as well. And we actually can make few changes here, but I would like to just leave them as defaults. And you want to enable the CloudWatch logs for any debugging or anything like that. And here comes the table mappings. You want to decide which tables you want to send to the target here. So here we say add a selection rule, and the schema we want to choose as my schema. It is case sensitive. I believe it is my schema. Let me just make sure it is the right one here. Yeah, it is my schema, and the table name is employee. And let's just go back to the table name. As you can see here, you can specify wildcards. Here you can specify some transformations. You want to exclude specific tables, include some specific tables, columns, things like that. Again, not to a great extent, but you should be able to do rudimentary transformation here. And then you want the task to start right after this creation of this task. Okay, it is creating the task, and then we will actually create yet another one for sending it to DynamoDB as well. So let's create another task. Okay, so this is MySQL to DynamoDB task, and replication instance is this. Source endpoint is this. The only difference here is the target is DynamoDB, and here we want to choose again the same migrate existing data and ongoing changes. And here comes the table mapping. Whatever we specified earlier, we try to do the same thing here as well. So schema is my schema, and the table name is employee, and then transformation rules, we don't specify anything here, but we can say that exclude certain columns, things like that. And we basically create this task as well. Okay, so that means, as you can see here, both tasks are on, and let us see if this bit has made any progress. Okay, so if you see any data going through, then you should be able to see some statistics here. While that is happening, let's go to S3 to see if the data has come here. You see that already it has created a DMS folder here. In this, my schema is already created, employee is created, and a CSV file is created, which has got this long name. And if you want to see what it is, and here let us see if we can actually see what is contained in this. Actually, for this you can use query S3 select, actually, which is interesting. So here you can just run this query here. Basically, we are trying to query the S3. So here you can see that the data has come as expected. The 4 records are here. Let's just confirm that DynamoDB works as well here. DynamoDB. So there are no tables created here. Let us see if the task is running or not. Yeah, it is starting the task, and let us see if it takes few minutes for the task to be created. And while that is happening, you can see that the status of the task here is changed to load complete replication ongoing, and you should be able to see how many records have been sent across. And for DynamoDB as well, it says that it has sent 4 records. So if we refresh it, we should be able to see some stuff here. We are not able to see anything because we are in London region. I don't know why. Let's go to Northern Virginia. We should be able to see that here. Boom. As you see here, it has created a few tables here, and it has created employee and a couple of tables here. But remember that these are the extra tables it creates, and it creates them with a provisioned capacity of 200. Obviously, if you forget to remove these tables, it's going to cost you money. So definitely after the exercise is done, you want to remove all the tables that get created here. But let us see the items here, whatever is created. So the 4 items are here. Now let's go back to the MySQL client, and then we will modify some data and then see if that gets reflected here. So here we say 10, 20, 30, 40, and okay, and then we also delete delete from employee, where emp ID is less than 10. Okay, so we are inserting 4 records, deleting 4 records. Let's see if we can execute it. It executed everything, and if we select here, we should see 4 records, which is having the 10, 20, 30, 40. Let us see what is happening on the S3 side. So if we query this now, you still see this actually, because obviously the way it is going to work is slightly different in S3 here. Let's just keep watching this folder here. You should see another file which contains the delta changes that are there. But whereas if you see the DynamoDB here, if you query this, you see the changes are straight applied. So this is another important thing to observe, is that depending on the target, it's the behavior of DMS changes. So if you've got MySQL as the target, obviously the transactions happen on the target. But if you've got S3, obviously S3, the way the transactions, it's all file based, right, in terms of how the files get deposited here. So you don't see that this original file is altered. Instead, you see yet another file. And also there is a bit of lag compared to the way the data has reached to the DynamoDB. For DynamoDB, almost it is instantaneous, but whereas for my S3 as a target, there is going to be a small bit of lag here. So yeah, now you see that it has come here. Let us see what is in this new file that came here. So let's go to here and then query with S3 select. And if you see it, you see that the data has come in slightly different way. What it is saying is the first letter here indicates whether it is an insert or update or delete. In this case, it is saying it is insert 10, employee 10. So 4 inserts and a delete of the records here. Because we are seeing one, because we are just limiting it to 5 here. Let's say we limit it to 10. We should see all 4 deletes here. Okay. So if you get changes more and more happening, you see more and more files getting deposited here. You can change the behavior slightly, but this is how the S3 as a target works. But whereas for DynamoDB, you see that the changes are straight away there. Okay, so that pretty much concludes what we wanted to cover in this demo. Hopefully it probably has given you a picture of what are all the steps which are involved here in terms of configuring the sources, endpoints, the targets, and then connect to the RDS source. There are different ways how you can do this. This is just one of the ways how you can do that. Let's just go back to the slides and conclude this. So I think we have done this task definition. We have created the 2 tasks. So recap in terms of what we have done here is we first created an MySQL Aurora database, and then we used the default security group, which has got a self-referencing inbound rule and all going outbound rule, and the same security group we attached to the DMS replication instance as well. And then we created a S3 bucket, and then we created a policy, and then we created a role associated with it, and then we tried to create a target endpoint and then tested the connection. Similarly for DynamoDB, we created a policy and a role, and then we tried to test the target. And on the MySQL Aurora side, we have done a couple of extra things. We create the Bastion server to be able to connect and then be able to send data, and to be able to define schema, and also be able to set the binlog parameters. And here on the Aurora side, we have changed the cluster parameter group to enable the binlocks. So basically to support the CDC or the change data capture. And also we set the retention period. We rebooted the server, and here we used as Bastion RDS security group, so that the RDS allows communication from the Bastion server. Similarly, we used a specific security group here on the Bastion server to allow the connection from the internet here. And then we have done the few changes in the data here, and then we saw it on the other side of the target that the data is received, and the behavior is different depending on the target. Okay, that pretty much concludes what we wanted to cover in this. And again, a big thank you for attending this long session. Obviously, as you can see, there are a lot of steps involved in this, and that's why this session took so long. And you want to repeat this with other DMS sources and targets like Kinesis or MongoDB. The procedure is pretty much the same, but obviously the steps in terms of how you want to do it, specific steps may slightly vary. And also you consider improving the security posture of the solution. Obviously, depending on this your context, you might want to go for a much more rigorous security posture in terms of enabling the service endpoints, or maybe using SSL and other things as well. And finally, don't forget to delete all all the stuff that we created in this demo. Essentially, you want to stop and delete the DMS replication tasks, and then delete the endpoints, and then you'll be able to delete the replication instance. You can't straight delete the replication instance. You have to delete the tasks, you have to delete the endpoints, then you'll be able to delete the replication instance. And then also you want to delete the DynamoDB tables and the extra tables that it creates. Otherwise, you're going to incur a bit of charge on these tables, which will be created with 200 read-write capacity, and you want to delete those tables as well. And then you want to delete the RDS cluster and delete any IEM roles as well associated with it. So let's go to the DynamoDB and delete all these tables that we created here. Actions, delete. So okay, that will take care of DynamoDB tables. Now let's go to the replication tasks here. So you want to delete the tasks first. So you have to stop them first before deleting it. And while that is happening, let's delete the RDS cluster as well. We don't want final snapshot. Let's just make sure it is the right cluster that we are deleting. Okay, we are deleting that, and once these tasks are stopped, you get rid of them. Yeah, both tasks are stopped. Let's delete them. And once deleted, we'll be able to delete the endpoints as well. I hope if you try it, it would say no. Yeah, you can't delete it until the targets are all gone. And in the meanwhile, let's delete this. Okay, both tasks are gone. Now go to the endpoints and let's try to delete all three. So now the endpoints are getting deleted, and once done, we will be able to delete the replication instance. We can delete the IAM roles as well. These two roles, what we created, we are going to delete them. Okay. Okay, now all the endpoints are gone. Now let's just go to the replication instance and delete it. Good. It says it's deleting the replication instance as well. That pretty much concludes this session. And once again, thanks a lot for attending this session, and really appreciate you. And if you have any comments, anything, please do post it and share it. Really appreciate it. And also, if you can subscribe to the channel, that will be great.